It is Friday, December the 28th, 2018. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast. I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, the Iran-Contra affair. That's right, we're going to explore the dirty dealings of an American Imperial intelligence apparatus. Of course, spanned the globe and ended with absolutely no accountability for any of the bloody hands involved on the shadow of a Christmas pardon. But of course, before we get to all of that, just a brief reminder that today's show is, of course, brought to you by people like you, listeners who go to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become a recurring donor for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons there. Speaking of patrons, this is important, so listen up. I'll repeat it again at the end of the show. There is a survey, very brief, 8 questions, all of them optional, save one. Most multiple choice or sliding scale. It's a survey about the podcast. Really appreciate it if you could go there and fill it out. Not harvesting any information from you, not even keeping your email addresses. In fact, if one were so inclined, it would be very easy to game the survey and totally destroy my results. Please don't do that. The biggest thing that you can do, regardless of your responses, is just take the survey. It won't take you more than a couple minutes. Really just gives me, more than anything, a sort of window into the amount of response I can generate with such a request. So thank you in advance. I really appreciate it. Just a brief content note before I get started. There are 2 great difficulties that I've tried to overcome in telling you the story of Iran-Contra. The first is that a lot of the participants involved deliberately destroyed evidence, told lies to both the media and Congress and to federal Justice Department officials at different times about what they were doing and why they were doing it, which makes it kind of hard to pin down exactly what the truth is. The second is that because the scandal spanned both Nicaragua and Iran, in addition to the dirty dealings of the United States executive branch, to really tackle it in great detail, you got to know a ton about geopolitics in Iran, Nicaragua, and the United States in the 80s. That's a pretty tall order, I think. I've, of course, tried to be diligent in assembling all the facts for you in a way that I think makes sense. Tell you a story about what happened, mostly focused on the American side, of course, because that is my country, but also give you some context about the others. I appreciate your patience and understanding in this endeavor. All right, enough pregame. So, as some of us celebrated Christmas, or perhaps just lounged about, tasting the last crumbs of this year in anticipation of a new, it reminded me that the Christmas season is often a time for mercy and clemency. And like most human endeavors of benevolence, like mercy and clemency, in the hearts of evil men, such endeavors are often turned to foul purpose, I think. President Andrew Johnson extended mercy when he declared, quote, unconditionally and without reservation, a full pardon and amnesty for the offense of treason against the United States or of adhering to their enemies during the late Civil War, with restoration of all rights, privileges, and immunities under the Constitution, end quote. He was delivering his 4th and final pardon to all former Confederates after the U.S. Civil War on Christmas Day, 1868. An act of mercy that remains a terrible mistake, both practically and symbolically, in my proudly amateur opinion. On the other hand, not quite Christmas, but about a month later, on January 21st, 1977, Jimmy Carter proclaimed, quote, all persons who may have committed any offense between August 4th, 1964 and March 28th, 1973 in violation of the Military Selective Service Act, or any rule or regulation promulgated thereunder, and all persons heretofore convicted, irrespective of the date of conviction of any offense committed between August 4th, 1964 and on March 28, 1973, in violation of the Military Selective Service Act or any rule or regulation promulgated thereunder, restoring to them full political, civil, and other rights, end quote. This, of course, was about draft dodging during Vietnam. This gift of mercy, though it faced criticism for leaving out deserters, soldiers dishonorably discharged, or anti-war demonstrators, among others, was nevertheless mercy turned to good purpose. Or as a better wordsmith than I once put it, quote, earthly power doth then show us like gods, when mercy seasons justice. But in troubled times such as our own, there were once another series of pardons on Christmas Eve by a president that unfortunately probably have more to tell us about today than those previous mentioned. On Christmas Eve, 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush, scion of Connecticut, privileged fresh off of being defeated by some slack-jawed hayseed from Arkansas, issued 6 unconditional pardons, all to privileged men, all who worked in the highest levels of our government, and all involved in illegal dealings in a thing called the Iran-Contra affair. For me, plenty look to President Nixon for precedent when dealing with a president who is a liar and a crook. And it ain't so much that such people are wrong, really. But I think for some at least, because the thing ended with Nixon walking, the scenario is that much more attractive to gawk at. And I have a sinking feeling that the decades-plus-long effort to funnel weapons to the Iranians and use the proceeds as a slush fund for armed right-wing Contra-revolutionaries in Nicaragua, whose story really begins around 1980 and ends with no prison-based repercussions on Christmas Eve 1992, this has got more to tell us about how criminal prosecutions of elite executive branch misdeeds can go than we might wish. And at this point, the events in question qualify as historic, I think. Historic, but often misunderstood, I think. But you won't misunderstand, listener. You're so smart and cool. So let's dive in to the story of how that Christmas gift from Poppy Bush came to be, and why. So, Iran-Contra, I suppose starting with Iran is natural. So, just to refresh your memory, of course, Iran used to be a kingdom, and the king used to be a friend of Uncle Sam's from 1953, until pretty suddenly it wasn't. The king, or Shah, was in exile, and an Islamic republic was declared on April 1st, 1979. The American government was not pleased with this, obviously, not least because the abrupt swing in politics meant several dozen American hostages were taken. But I don't really want to mince words here. The Shah was a brutal and authoritarian ruler who frequently suppressed not just lefties and socialists, but liberals and dissenters of all kinds, who ended any attempt in Iran to assert sovereignty over its national resources, including oil. And he was our man, all for around a quarter of a century. Now, as you might imagine, when overthrowing a government installed via American superpower, the Iranian Republic's inherited military hardware was almost all American provided. And after Iraq invaded them in September of 1980, this was when the Iranians' desire for replacement weapons, ammunition, and spare parts, etc., became a little more acute. And thus the situation stood when our first TV president, Ronald Reagan, took office in January of 1981. Across the ocean blue in Central America, another U.S.-backed family dynasty was falling around the same time. Anastasio Somoza Debayle, usually just called Somoza, was fleeing Nicaragua in July of 1979, carrying with him much of the country's treasury. President like his older brother and father before him, I won't spend too much time on such a dastardly villain who used extrajudicial killings, brutal suppression of the press and political dissent, and U.S. military-trained forces to rule his country. But in addition to the sort of standard tactics employed by all men of history who, like old Pompey, urge people not to speak of laws to men who carry swords, I'll tell you something kind of interesting about the man fleeing the country in 1979. He was immensely wealthy, as U.S.-backed dictators tend to be, and he and his son were part owners in a Nicaraguan company called Plasmapheresis. which collected plasma from around 1,000 poor Nicaraguans a day in return for a pittance, which was then shipped away to the United States and Europe for a substantial profit. Anyway, this asshole was being overthrown by a revolutionary coalition of liberals, socialists who were Marxists to differing degrees, and also, I hasten to add, fueled in large part by liberation theologists and radical Christians. I don't want to over-romanticize the Sandinistas, who were not perfect. But one thing this coalition broadly took seriously was its own national sovereignty, whatever the wishes and interests of the empire to its north, which basically meant that they were incredibly resistant to American overtures during the Carter administration, and one reason why Reagan and his people are going to be incredibly interested in destroying them. The other reason is that the Sandinistas' efforts to reform their economy to a truly mixed model, tackle their social deficiencies like poor literacy rates, healthcare, and social welfare, were incredibly successful and internationally recognized as such. And they accomplished a lot of that with the help of Cuba, even if they resisted much of Cuba's economic model. In other words, the risk of a successful and more socialist society on the doorstep of the richest military empire the planet has ever known was not something late Cold War-era Republicans were going to tolerate. And so things stood in Nicaragua as Reagan assumed office in 1981. Now, from this point in history, in January of 1981, I'm going to try to tell you the story chronologically of what happened in the United States, Iran, and Nicaragua, all, which is harder than it sounds. But I'm mostly going to focus on my own government's actions, because it was the Reagan administration, helmed by a serious-looking, if supremely incurious and simple-minded B-movie actor, who set in motion what came next. Now, dumb as he was, his team of tough-minded experts from our country's finest institutions conducted a secret study in July of 1981, a few months after Reagan assumed office, and concluded, among other things, two facts. First, fans or not of the regime that had overthrown the Shah in Tehran, our official arms embargo against them was mostly ineffective, and they could, without too much trouble, get most of what they needed to fight a war with Iraq, embargo or not. Somewhat contradictorily, they also concluded that the arms embargo, even if it was ineffective, might drive the Iranians into the embrace of the hated Soviets, and so we should start selling Iran weapons as soon as possible. So the plan became generally for the Israeli government to ship weapons to Iran in order to encourage the war between Iraq and Iran, which they were very interested in. Israel would be resupplied like us, who, like a good client state, would pay us all for the privilege. It's important to remark that these arms sales first occurred at a time when no hostages were being held by the Iranians or their forces outside of Iran. Back across the ocean, the CIA and Argentinian intelligence persuaded remnants of Somoza loyalists, formerly of the National Guard, a small contingent of business interests, to unify with a smattering of other discontented and disenchanted folks in September 1981. This was really the beginning of what is popularly known as the Contras, anti-Sandinista forces who would soon wage what they called war, but was little more than terrorism on the population of Nicaragua. Let me be absolutely clear. Any military significance the Contras had in Nicaragua was wholly a result of American efforts, which puts the blame for the resulting civil war squarely upon Uncle Sam, in my estimation. The Civil War would wax and wane for years, until Congress, of course, put on its big boy pants, right? In December of 1982, they passed an amendment, usually referred to as the Boland Amendment, which actually became 3 amendments over time, all of which are usually called the Boland Amendment. But the first said that Congress, quote, prohibits the use of funds by the Central Intelligence Agency or the Department of Defense to furnish military assistance to certain groups seeking to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, end quote. Reagan's hogs in the White House remarked that aid for purposes other than overthrowing the government would still be okay, and who's to say what overthrowing the government really even means? So for this and other reasons, their first pass was pretty ineffective. later amendments became more specific. By October 3rd, 1984, after funding for the Contras had run out a few months previous, the law of the land became, quote, during the fiscal year 1985, no funds available to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities may be obligated or expended for the purpose of or which may have the effect of supporting directly or indirectly military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua by any nation, organization, group, movement, or individual, end quote. Now, I'm no lawyer, but that seems very specific to me. Now, in response, Reagan ordered his National Security Council to keep the Contras together, quote, body and soul, end quote, no matter what. That December of 1984. And what you should really hear when I say that is that Reagan was dedicated to prolonging a bloody civil war until the population abandoned its government and their troublesomely successful economic models. And so they became incredibly hungry for funds outside of the appropriations process to achieve this. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane would get the Saudis to pitch in $32 million over a couple years to the Contras. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, $2 million from Taiwan somehow, for example. But the Contras really needed a steady flow of resources because they basically had very few allies either in Nicaragua or without it that weren't U.S.-backed. And lo and behold, McFarlane also began preaching of moderates inside Iran who we could safely sell missiles and shit to. And we really should, because what if the Soviets start doing it instead? So again, using Israel as a cutout, we sent a goodly amount of anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles between August and September 1985, in addition to around $300 million worth of military supplies between 1981 and 1983. And by this time, Iranian-backed Hezbollah had indeed taken Americans hostage in Lebanon. Now, it is true that some of the administration at some points thought that by selling Iranian interest weapons, that they could help with these hostage situations. But the point is that this is really reading things backwards, and that whatever they would say publicly from time to time about that dynamic, this was never about trading weapons for hostages in the first place, even if selling the weapons did probably free some hostages who wouldn't otherwise have been. In other words, from the Reagan administration's point of view anyway, this was about keeping Nicaragua and Iran out of the Soviet sphere of influence. So, moving on, in 1986, under a new National Security Advisor, Admiral Poindexter, sales of weapons to Iran continued, and it was actually a Lebanese paper that November that first reported on arms sales for hostage release that seemed to be happening in the Middle East involving the Americans and Iranians. A month before that, an aircraft carrying a shitload of guns and rocket launchers was brought down over Nicaragua. And the captured former U.S. Marine alleged that Uncle Sam was behind all of it, even if at first Uncle Sam denied it. And thus the threads began to connect. Arms sales to Iran, using the Israelis as a cutout, which began as a way of keeping Soviet influence from spreading, had morphed into a way to make people holding Americans hostage less angry, more amenable to letting those hostages go. That same month, November, Ollie North and Secretary shredded enough documents to break at least one government machine. It was actually genius Ollie North who accidentally entered the wrong number on a Swiss bank account he was using to launder money to the Contras and sent some random businessman $10 million. Anyway, like any bigwig of our modern media era, when there's a scandal, the president appoints a big, fancy commission. And this commission went and looked, talked to everyone, and concluded that, boy, the president sure did have some irresponsible underlings. But he himself, of course, was in the dark about almost everything. An assessment contradicted by the president's own testimony to the commission, which was very inconsistent, that Reagan had indeed secretly ordered his National Security Council to keep the civil war in Nicaragua going, and that Reagan did indeed sign off on arms sales to Iran personally several times. Now, Reagan went on TV and said we never traded any arms for hostages, which we first didn't and then did start to do, basically. But he also said the evidence pointed otherwise, and he said he was sorry. The truth is even worse, that we sold them weapons both when they had hostages and when they didn't, and that Reagan's direction to his subordinates to find a way to keep the Contras together without congressional aid that was ironically reinstated a month before this story broke. I don't want to be overly legalistic. It was never proven in a U.S. court that Reagan's administration violated congressional statutes prohibiting funds to be used to support counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua, but it sure looks that way to me. Now, I won't focus on all the indictments, testimony, or court cases that preceded, except to comment that, through a series of plea bargains, reversals upon appeal, and pardons, not a single person went to jail as a result of the actions of Reagan or his minions, with one absurd section, which I will revisit in conclusion. And I will also tell you that nearly all the charges were related to lying, withholding evidence, obstruction of justice, perjury, second-order crimes. I will tell you of the Christmas pardons, though, to give you a hint of the bitter flavor of mercy when distributed from the powerful. Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense of these United States. 2 counts perjury, 1 count obstruction of justice. Pardoned before his trial took place. Robert McFarlane, of course, Reagan's national security advisor, like I told you before, pled down to withholding evidence, 2 years probation, erased by pardon. Elliot Abrams, Assistant Secretary of State, same charge, same sentence, same situation as McFarlane, pled down to withholding evidence, 2 years probation, erased by pardon. Alan D. Fires, the CIA chief for Central America and a real son of a bitch, with gallons of blood on his hands personally and other ways, pled down to 1 year probation for withholding evidence, meager justice, withdrawn by pardon. Dwayne Claridge, another CIA goon with a weird name, indicted on 7 counts of perjury and false statements, pardoned before his trial took place. And Claire George, chief for CIA covert ops, convicted, 2 counts of perjury, pardoned Christmas Eve before sentencing. Lastly, Ollie North, who's been rehabilitated enough since all this to slime his way onto television, and was extremely instrumental for the acquisition of funds and the destruction of evidence regarding the whole thing, as well as John Poindexter, Reagan's other national security advisor. These men both faced the greatest deal of heat, legally speaking, but both their convictions were overturned for indirect use in the trial of their immunized congressional testimony. For his part, George H.W. Bush, who was the vice president at the time and a former CIA director, said he didn't know anything about the whole thing all during the 1988 election, but failed to reveal the existence of his own diaries that straight up say, quote, "I'm one of the few people that fully know the details," end quote, about what was happening regarding relations with Iran and Nicaragua and how they were connected. Alright, I won't prattle on to you anymore about names or dark plots of the United States government to foment death and terror in other countries, but to get personal with you, listener, I've always been, naively perhaps, fascinated by the concepts of justice and righteousness, how they work, how to determine them, how to find the right thing to do in any given society, hopefully derived from a set of principles that are as close to universally applicable as you can get. That's the dream, anyway. However one may put it, I'm hardly alone in this, I think. And whether you're searching for the production of justice or simply searching to produce it yourself, you always run up against this concept called law. Now, I'm, of course, not a lawyer, got no plans to become one in the near future, but if you ask me, to look upon the law with naked eyes and a heart yearning for justice, for righteousness, for mercy, for God's sake, in this heartless world of ours, you do that, you'll be forced to weep. You don't need to go to law school to see how justice applied by our highest courts, by our greatest minds, by our institutions of elite thought, that justice is so often twisted toward sourness. You don't need extensive case law to know the language of equity and fairness and even goodness and rightness themselves. However eloquently or clumsily they're worded, long-winded or concise, so often in the end result in mercy for those who encourage the butchering of civilians, cocaine trafficking, all manner of nasty business, as long as they do it in the service of power. Wish I had more answers regarding this problem, of course. Other than if you're looking for justice that punishes the elite effectively, you're not likely to find it in the federal building that shares the name. This ain't it, Chief, you might say. But we can't all be doom and gloom. One American at least did suffer a bit for all the dirty deeds I've told you about today. In Odin, Indiana, Bill Breeden, once an evangelical preacher, now a retired Unitarian minister, was pissed. See, he shared his hometown with John Poindexter, the national security advisor I told you about, who had faced more legal heat than most for all this bullshit. And the town had honored Poindexter, his distinguished son of the town, with a street. Bill Breeden stole the accompanying street sign. Felony theft. He said he was holding it ransom for $30 million. Thought to be the amount of money at the time in total funneled from Iran to the Contras in Nicaragua. After a ridiculous 3-day-long manhunt, where the cops couldn't lay hands on him, but the press seemed to have no trouble finding him for interviews, he turned himself in. During his trial, one juror, an 18-year-old at the time, refused to vote for felony conviction. So in the end, Bill Breeden served 4 days in jail for a Class A misdemeanor. The only American citizen to ever see the inside of a cell as a result of this whole sorry affair. At his best, man is the noblest of all animals. Separated from law and justice, he is the worst. So said an ancient philosopher who wiped his ass with his hands. Thought disease was caused by an imbalance of humors. So take him with a grain of salt. Kind of depends on what you mean by law and justice, you know. Nazis love laws, for example. Makes sense to be skeptical of such things, I think, if not completely dismissive. But even divorced from legalism, nothing really strips it all bare. It shows how even the noblest and purest of concepts, like mercy and clemency, to be words in the wind, like a Christmas Eve pardon for a bunch of intelligence agency butchers. Thank you for listening. Have a happy new year. I want to remind you, of course, go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant if you are a patron. $1 a month or more. Please take the survey. It doesn't take long. I appreciate it. Next time on the show, we're going to begin exploring that most American of religions, and the man who founded it, Joseph Smith. Looking forward to it, I hope. Alright, see you next time.